Leading Authorities presents Conversations with Power, live from the night studio at the Newseum in downtown Washington, D.C., featuring prominent media personalities represented by leading authorities and today's newsmakers in business and politics. Conversations with Power is filmed before a live studio audience and broadcast over the web. Today, our discussion will focus on the Middle East. A wave of unrest across the region has commanded the attention of the world. Now, change of government and military rule in Egypt, civil war in Libya, resignation of the Tunisian prime minister, war in Iraq, conflict between Israel and Palestine, nuclear weapons in Iran, financial crisis in the United Arab Emirates, the funding of Hezbollah in Syria, and anti-government protests in Bahrain, Qatar, and Yemen have all created an environment that is both extremely volatile and important to understand. The instability of the Middle East affects us both here and abroad. Regime or other political policy changes affect the price of oil, our military, trade, investment, and global security. Our panel today consists of four highly distinguished and renowned experts on the Middle East: Ambassador Nicholas Burns, General Michael Hayden, Raghida Dergham, and Kenneth Pollack. Our discussion will be moderated by National Journal's Major Garrett. Ambassador Nick Burns is the former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, the former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, and the former U.S. Ambassador to Greece. General Michael Hayden is a 40-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the former director of the National Security Agency. Raghida Dergham is the senior diplomatic correspondent for Al Hayat, the leading independent Arabic daily, and a political analyst for NBC and MSNBC. Kenneth Pollack is the Director and Senior Fellow of Foreign Policy at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy and author of A Path Out of the Desert, A Grand Strategy for America in the Middle East. Today's moderator, Major Garrett, is formerly the Chief White House Correspondent for Fox News and currently a Congressional Correspondent for the National Journal with decades of experience covering politics. Leading Authorities would like to thank our generous sponsors: CEO Update, Citibank, The Broadmoor, and Smart Brief. Now, please welcome our host for today's conversation, the President of Leading Authorities, Mark French.
All right. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this second Conversations with Power program, this time focusing on the Middle East. Our program today is being presented to this live audience here at the Newseum in Washington, as well as to a virtual audience nationwide via webcast, and will also be archived on the Leading Authorities website at leadingauthorities.com. Again, we'd like to thank our sponsors, CEO Update, Citibank, The Broadmoor, and Smart Brief for their support, and our panel of experts and our moderator, Major Garrett. Today's program could not be more timely as American warships make their way from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean off the coast of Libya. Economists, investors, CEOs, political scientists, and indeed all of us are making their calculations and speculations about the impact of the current unrest in the Middle East. The Washington Post reports this morning that Libyan rebels are calling for foreign intervention, and Muammar Gaddafi's forces are beginning to retake ground from the opposition. So far, the main toll in the region has been limited to a relatively small number of small oil producers: Algeria, Yemen, Bahrain, and Libya. But what if the unrest spreads to Saudi Arabia and Iran? What will the impact be on oil prices, the economy, our military? How will these developments affect China, the world's number 2 oil importer, already reeling from inflation in food and wage prices? How will the dollar fare? In the last couple of weeks, the dollar has taken a fall against the euro, the Canadian and Australian dollars, British sterling, and the Swiss franc. Will it sink further? If it does, how will it impact inflation? How will it impact our recovery? How does Al-Qaeda figure in all of this? Will they benefit or suffer from these developments? And, of course, how do these developments affect our actions in Iraq and Afghanistan? how much more can our military take on, and how much more can we afford. To tackle these issues and engage our experts, I am pleased to cede the microphone to our moderator, Major Garrett. Major?
Mark, thank you very much. And to the audience here and to the virtual audience, I want to let you know my obligation, my job for the next hour and a half is to get as much information out of this distinguished expert panel as I can, so we're going to get straight to questions. I want to throw up into the panel something that Newsweek wrote 2 weeks ago. It was about Egypt particularly, but it was a broader statement about whether the Obama administration is and is not and all this turmoil in the Middle East. Let me quote from it directly. The defining characteristic of Obama's foreign policy has been not just a failure to prioritize, but also a failure to recognize the need to do so. A succession of speeches saying, in essence, quote, "I am not George W. Bush," is no substitute for a strategy. So I want to throw this open to the panel right now as a broad umbrella statement. Where do you think U.S. policy is right now? Is it coherent? Does it have a strategic focus? And if not, what should it be? Nick, I'll start with you.
Well, thanks, Major, for throwing it to me first, and good morning, everybody. And I want to thank leading authorities and my fellow panelists for this opportunity. I emphatically disagree with the Newsweek article, particularly pertaining to the Middle East, and I'll tell you why. No one has been ahead of these events. No one's been ahead of the curve. The journalists haven't, and the NGOs haven't, and the governments haven't. I think the Obama administration has done well to try to apply American influence when we can apply it. And the most dramatic event was Egypt. Over 3 weeks, protests in Tahrir Square. I thought the president did two things very well, representing American interests. First, he clearly threw our weight behind the reformers in the street as early as January 28th, the third day of the crisis. And so he was clear about that we had to be on the side of democracy and reform for those young kids in the streets who wanted that. Second, he didn't listen to his critics, many in the press and many in our political system, who said he ought to be on a soapbox in Tahrir Square directing the play. He held back a little bit. He used our influence behind the scenes with President Mubarak and Omar Suleiman to gently encourage these old friends of ours, and they were good friends of ours, that they had lost credibility with their street, they'd lost control of their country, they had to leave power. I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition and balancing of what we can say appropriately in public and what we ought to be doing behind the scenes. The second example would be Bahrain, where we have considerable influence. And there's no question in my mind that Secretary Clinton and President Obama were instrumental in pulling the government of Bahrain back from the use of force against protesters in Pearl Square. We're seeing in Libya, it's the final point I'd make, that here's a country where the United States does not have a lot of influence. That's a vile, despotic regime, the Gaddafi regime. We are not close to them. There is no formal opposition because over 42 years Gaddafi hasn't allowed an opposition to rise. So I think there appropriately the administration's held back. We focused on getting American citizens out of Libya. Secretary Gates, I thought, spoke very wisely yesterday when he questioned whether we should be leaping into a military engagement in Libya because it's difficult and complex. We will likely not have anybody with us should we elect to do that. So I thought his caution was appropriate. There are 22 Arab countries. Each of these dramas is going to have different sociologies and histories and politics, and we're going to have to be able to react to each one of them in a different way. I give the administration high marks.
Raghida?
I too want to thank you and thank leading authorities for hosting us here and my fellow distinguished members of this panel. I think the administration in Washington needs to have a comprehensive strategy. I do not agree that there is clarity about what the strategy is, and I do not agree that the United States should be sort of running behind the events. It is very important to forecast a little bit. We already know what is the sort of the landscape of what's happening in the region in terms of bringing down regimes, but we don't know what is going to be replacing these regimes. I agree with you, Nick, that in Egypt, the administration played a very important role, particularly with the military. If you would remember, had it not been for the American intervention with the military in Egypt, maybe things wouldn't have been concluded as well as they have so far. I think in Libya, I think we have a trouble. The trouble would be right now is that I think Gaddafi and his regime painted itself in a corner, and we may be, in the United States and the international community, painting ourselves in the corner. That is to say, it may be too late for either to pull back. He is escalating. He is saying that he's not going to give in, that he will not live. He's pretending that nothing is happening in order so that he will go on with his atrocities against his own people and with his policy to play the tribal card. But I think also the international community has gone very far in saying, now we are going to confront you. So this is something we'll have to see how it's going to work out. We will have a debate within the United States. Do we do the no-fly zone? We are for it. We are against it. Is it necessary to go to hit certain military targets? The Libyans are telling us, we do not want you to come in with boots on the ground. We just want you to do everything from the air. Is that possible? So I think the debate is there. And I'll just say quickly, on Bahrain, I agree with you. The administration came in and said, pull back to the government. There is worry. There is more coordination with the GCC, but the Gulf Council cooperation, but they are worried about how quickly did the administration pull the rug from underneath Mubarak. So that is, from their point of view, the reliable ally has been sort of given up too quickly, rather than the transition to sort of a dignified exit. Yemen is the most dangerous place because you have Al-Qaeda, the most dangerous place because right now we're having a very public fight between the administration and Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president there, and because if you have trouble and disintegration in Yemen, and you have some sort of disintegration and partition in Libya, and you have lack of stability in Bahrain, then you look at Saudi Arabia. And I'll leave that for the next round.
And Mike and Ken, yes, because there will be many rounds, to be sure. Mike and Ken, I want to add another element to the Newsweek criticism. America's two closest friends in the region, Israel and Saudi Arabia, are both disgusted. The Saudis, who dread all manifestation of revolution, are appalled at Washington's failure to resolutely prop up Mubarak. This is particularly about Egypt. The Israelis, meanwhile, are dismayed by the administration's apparent cluelessness. For the two of you, evaluate this level of criticism, and is there a strategic vision? Does there need to be, and if so, what should it be?
I can just picture the conversations going on between folks in my old agency and their counterparts in both the Saudi and the Israeli services. Intelligence services tend to be fairly candid with one another. Now, all that said, we shouldn't overstate or even overassume the degree of influence we as Americans have on these events. It's not a bad thing to be a bit modest about what it is we can and cannot control there. I used to describe my role in the sit room, and I can imagine these meetings going on right now. The intel guy gets to set the left and the right-hand boundaries of the conversation. Right? You get too far over here or too far over there, you're outside of reality. I actually think the administration, and anyone can disagree with any particular statement or step or tactic, but by and large, I think they have stayed within what I would have described as the left and the right-hand boundary that the intel guys would have laid out for them. And there are nuances within that. I mean, there are some times where one day you want to emphasize one note with, say, the Egyptian government, and the next day, tactically, you need to publicly emphasize a different note. I wouldn't hold them to some abstract standard of consistency. This is really hard to do.
Ken?
Major, I'd say that I would agree with the first quote that you read from Newsweek. I think that there is a need for a strategic vision. Let me talk about that in just a moment. But one thing I would say with regard to the second quote is that I don't think that necessarily it's a strategic vision for the United States toward the Middle East that ought to be made either in Jerusalem or Riyadh. So the fact that the Saudis and Israelis are unhappy doesn't necessarily mean that what we're doing is wrong. I'd also agree with Nick. I think that, and Mike said the same thing, that policy making in the midst of a crisis is enormously difficult. We've all been there. It's something unimaginable if you haven't been there. And I think the administration has tactically done quite well in dealing with all of the different things thrown at them. Prior to the crisis, I think my read of the administration is I think they've handled some aspects of the Middle East well, other aspects quite poorly. But I do think that the quotation is right, that what has really been lacking from the administration is an overarching strategic vision for the Middle East. The president laid it out in his Cairo speech in 2009. It was a brilliant vision for the Middle East. And unfortunately, the administration walked away from it before the echoes of the president's words had died. What I think is going on now, and what I hope is going on now, is that the administration is recognizing that it was a mistake to have walked away from the strategic vision articulated in the Cairo speech. And what I am hearing from them is a recognition that, you know what, this reform thing really is important, that change is coming to the Middle East, that it was a mistake for us not to have gotten out ahead of it before this set of crises, and that this crisis needs to be a galvanizing factor in actually pushing us back to where we started out. That's my hope, and it's exactly what I think is necessary.
I've never been in the Situation Room, but I've talked to people who have been, and I want to create a mini Situation Room on this panel, if I could. Put before this panel, no-fly zone in Libya. Good idea, bad idea, executionable, meaning can we actually do it, and should we pursue that? I'll start with you, Ken.
My read, bad idea. I spent a lot of time at CIA and at the White House trying to enforce, from the Washington side of things, the no-fly zones over Iraq. I think that those had a very important role in U.S. policy toward Iraq. I think that they served an important purpose. Libya is a different case, and what we need to recognize about no-fly zones is, first of all, they are passive in a situation where being passive often means that you wind up being roadkill. There's a lot of mission creep involved. We almost certainly can ground the Libyan Air Force. Well, that's not going to stop Gaddafi's guys from killing people on the ground. And once you've taken responsibility in that way, it's going to be very hard to resist calls to, okay, now do something about the tanks who are killing people. Now do something about the infantry that are killing people. And it's the infantry that do most of the killing. I think that there are some military options available to us in Libya if we want to do them, but they are going to require a much more aggressive approach to things beyond where I think that we are politically. But to me, the no-fly zone is, trying to have it both ways, and I think we're going to wind up betwixt and between and with our foot in a trap.
Mike, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, yesterday expressed some reservations about this, as did Defense Secretary Gates. What's your take on the...
Yeah, I was tactically involved in denied flight in Bosnia and Northern Watch and Southern Watch in Iraq. I feel more strongly about this than Ken does.
Bad idea. Nick?
I'd say this. If I were talking to the President or Secretary of State, I'd say it might be a good idea, not right now. That's not just a diplomatic escape route. What I mean by that is, what we've got to do right now, we have very little influence on Gaddafi, as we've all established. We don't have a personal relationship with him. This is a mafia-style dictatorship in Tripoli. This is a despotic, evil regime. We can't influence him personally. His back's to the wall. He's given every indication he's going to go out in a vicious, brutal way if he does lose power. What can we do? We can build up military pressure on him. That's why the administration has deployed the USS Kearsarge to the area. That's why Secretary Clinton, I think, went out and said that a no-flight zone is a possibility. So building up the intimidation factor, trying to convince Gaddafi that we mean business, I think is not a bad thing to do. And there could be, if this civil war advances to a really terrible degree, if there's a humanitarian disaster on the scale of, say, a Darfur type situation, you might want to do this at some point. Right now, it doesn't make sense because, one, we shouldn't want to do it alone. Two, the Allies won't be with us. You'd need a NATO consensus. I'm a former ambassador to NATO. That's 28 countries. If the Security Council is to authorize it, Russia and China will veto it. So you're looking at the United States and a couple of countries doing this on their own. I think Secretary Gates, given his long years of experience in Washington, was very wise to say yesterday, we've already got 2 wars going on in the greater Middle East. Ken's admonition is very important. If you become an actor in the drama and you take sides, especially through military force, there is a process where you buy into it and you get sucked into it, and sooner or later you're part of the problem. You're part of the war yourself. We can't afford that right now.
But I think it's too late. I think already the escalation has brought about expectations. Right now, whether what Secretary Clinton said or whether...
expectations from whom?
But right now, the opposition in Libya, and they're banking on a no-fly zone from the NATO allies, not only from the United States. Now, I understand the reservations, and I may even share the point of view that it's not a good thing to get in so heavily because you could get dragged probably on the ground. I mean, and that's not what the United States wants. The United States wants to be power from above, not from the level. So we have a problem. We have raised their expectations, and in case we back down now from a no-fly zone or any such measures, guess who's going to feel emboldened? Guess who's going to feel that he made others back down? And we are in a dilemma because of the escalation. I am not, again, I want to say that I'm not saying let's go for the no-fly zone, but I think it's too late. I think we have to do something.
It puts before the panel another question, which is what we decide in Libya for the fate of Gaddafi could have ramifications in a lot of these other countries which are experiencing tumult in the streets. And there is a body of journalism now that says all the rulers in the region are taking cues from what Mubarak did not do, what Gaddafi is and is not doing, more on the is, and if they want to stay in power, they may choose progressively more violent means to hold to power. And so are there enormous stakes, not just for U.S. policy in Libya, but for these other nations that are about to make decisions about how to confront unrest in the streets? I throw that open. Anyone jump in?
Well, I think the obvious thing to say is we have enormous stakes in the Middle East. Understatement of the morning. When you think of what's at stake for the United States, obviously the oil-producing countries, the safety and security of Saudi Arabia, the free transit of oil and gas, Israel's security, containing Iran, making sure Iran does not get nuclear weapons in the future, and continuing relationships that have worked with us to block al-Qaeda and to defeat al-Qaeda and the other terrorist groups. So it should not be the policy of the United States to have all of our friends fall from power in the Middle East. I do think we reached the point after that extraordinary 3-week demonstration, people's demonstration, peaceful, for freedom and democracy. I think we made the right decision to say to an old friend, it's no longer sustainable for you to remain as president. But the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Emiratis and the Omanis and the Bahrainis are very close friends of the United States, and we should want to encourage them to reform sufficiently, but hope that they're going to survive, because behind many of their regimes are not Jeffersonian Democrats. The alternative, let's just take Yemen. We were talking before the show began. It was striking to me that Janet Napolitano, in the middle of the Egypt crisis, came out and said something that I think should have been on the front pages of the newspapers for a week. She said the greatest threat to American security is not al-Qaeda on the AfPak border, it's al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen. And so if the Yemeni regime falls, and President Ali has been a friend and partner of the United States, who knows who's going to replace him? It could be a radical Islamist regime. Real American interests are at stake. So caution. I don't know if it's possible to have a grand strategy in the middle of a raging hurricane. So you got to try to see your way forward as best you can. At some point, that grand strategy has to come. Yeah, but in the middle of the hurricane, I'm not sure it's possible to create.
But Yemen is not new. Yemen did not just happen yesterday. The surprise was in Egypt and it was in Tunisia, but we have seen it coming to Yemen for quite a long time, in the sense that what al-Qaeda has been doing in Yemen, the fact that we have been pressuring Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president of Yemen, to do reform, and now he's waking up to do it. I mean, this is one thing, one great advantage of all these revolutions and uprisings is to bring it home to the rulers that they must reform. But at this point, it's a bit too late. And we've known the problems of al-Qaeda, of the potential of the South splitting, of the Houthis, of the impact on Saudi Arabia. There was a mini war between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So let's not, we didn't just wake up and say, oh God, Yemen is happening today. And there is no strategy still, clearly. I do not understand how we are having a public fight with Ali Abdullah Saleh. How is the guy in Yemen, actually today or yesterday, I was reading in the news, some of the clerics have gotten in. And they're saying, now we want down with Ali Abdullah Saleh. What is our strategy? What is the United States going to do about that sort of place, the next Afghanistan or the next Somal?
Mike and Ken, yesterday, one of the well-known clerics in Yemen, a former mentor of Osama bin Laden, Abdul Majid al-Zinari, said there should be an Islamic State in Yemen and that Saleh must go.
That's right.
There were different interpretations of what that meant. That, yes, he did mean that there should be an Islamic State, and it's the worst possible scenario for U.S. interests. The other was, he just sees Salah's days are over, and he's getting on the other side. Right. And it's just a simple transactional thing that has no larger meaning or import in an Islamic State sense. What's your take on both of those issues, Ken and Mike?
Neither interpretation is very comfortable for us in any sense. And these things, as they play out over time, I mean, history tells us these hardly ever break to the center. They break to the extremes. And so when you have these cards being put on the table, they do create a great deal of uncertainty and maybe even increased danger. I think we've actually known what's going on in Yemen for a long time. This is overly irreverent, but someone asked me a day or two ago, what happens if the government of President Saleh falls? And my first comment was, will anybody notice? And the comment being there, the system there is so tribal, so diffuse, so based upon interpersonal relationships, right, that this is not like a centralized state like Egypt, undergoing a transformation. So we've known this cast of characters and these tectonic plates were all there and all moving and all pressuring one another in Yemen for a long time. But I ask you, so what are we to do about this? I mean, President Saleh, I've met with him. He's one of the most prickly counterterrorism partners we've ever had. He makes Tip O'Neill look modest when it comes to all politics are local. I mean, we would come to him, for example, you need to keep this man in jail. He's a very bad person. And he is, in our global view with regard to al-Qaeda and terrorism. He never saw the equation that way. What tribe is he from? Who do I owe? Who do I need to repay? And so again, our ability to influence this has always been quite small. And so, grand vision or not, the tools we had available were limited. Some of this stuff's just going to play out on its own merits. And the best we can do is try to influence it in more rather than less positive directions.
Yemen, scary as it sounds, Ken?
Major, actually, let me take that question in a slightly different direction, because I think that Mike has pretty much covered the conundrum of Yemen. But I think there's something else that's inherent both in your question and Mike's response, which is we need to recognize that revolutions are inherently unpredictable and unstable. We have a fondness for revolutions. We remember our own revolution fondly, and we can look at what's going on in Egypt and say, my God, this is fantastic. And there's no question it is. We need to remember that what's happened in Egypt so far is about as positive, about as good as it is possible to have imagined Egypt would turn out. And the problem with revolutions, when you look at them historically, is that they have a really bad habit of getting hijacked by the worst elements, exactly as Mike was pointing out. Now, that brings us back to a point that Nick was making before, and I think it's exactly what Raghida and I were talking about in terms of what a grand strategy ought to look like, which is right now all of the other countries of the region which have not yet undergone revolutions are terrified. And they're looking at two different models out there for how to survive. One is, quite frankly, the Iranian model, the Syrian model, greater oppression. We've seen both Syria and Iran deal with unrest in the last few weeks. They have snuffed it out. They snuffed it out in very violent fashion. And that's certainly one thing. And, a country like Saudi Arabia, I am certain that there are voices out there saying that's how we've got to handle any problems here. But there's another path out there. It is the path of reform. Now, we need to be a little bit careful because obviously the Middle East is wide open right now. And I say this with a great deal of trepidation because I could be proven wrong tomorrow. But I don't think that it is coincidental that we have not seen significant unrest, significant protests in either Saudi Arabia or Morocco. The reason is, in both of those countries, you have kings who long ago, when they came to power, went to their people and said, in effect, I get it. You're miserable. You are completely fed up with the economic, political, and social stagnation of our country, and I'm going to do something about it. And both of them began comprehensive programs of reform. Now, we can look at both Morocco and Saudi Arabia and say, hasn't gone far enough, hasn't gone fast enough. I actually think that both King Abdullah and King Mohammed would probably agree with that. But what's striking is that in both of those countries, both of those monarchs are very popular with their people. And they are popular because they acknowledge the problems and because they have tried to begin a program of reform. And I think that's where the U.S. goes with this. As we say to people, look, yes, there are two models here. There's Iran and Syria. That is a terrible model. It's not going to work. Even if it works in the short term, it's not going to work in the long term. The right way to go is to go with reform. That will get your people to a point where they want to go, and it'll do it without opening up the Pandora's box, the risks of these revolutions, which, we can hope that they turn out well, and we have to help them turn out well, but they can go very badly, very quickly.
Quickly, Raghida.
Yeah, can I say something on this? I think you're absolutely right to point out to Iran and Syria, because if they get away with what they're doing, and if they are spared a revolution that will bring about a reform, guess what? This is back to your point. The moderates in the region will be the losers. And the radicals will say, we won, and we're going to intimidate you from now on. And the friends of the United States would be saying, here we go again. You put your lot with the United States, and you're left in the middle of the road without any help, on your own.
Continuing with my Situation Room metaphor here, I want to put before you a question I know any president would want to have put around the table, which is, we'll deal with national security, we'll deal with intelligence, but there is an economic component, an enormously important economic component to all of this turmoil. And if you want to look at it in Tunisia, at a very micro level, this got started because a graduate, 26-year-old couldn't find a job, was depressed and demoralized about his own intimate, tactile economic future, set himself on fire. And that created a sense of disillusionment, or it set in motion a sense of disillusionment in Tunisia that spread to Egypt. And many of the things that are being sought in these countries experiencing this turmoil is, I have no economic destiny, I have no economic future, I have a hunger for political reforms, but I want to feed myself, I want to work. So at that micro level in the region, there's an economic component to this that runs through all of these nations. For us and for the Western world, there are enormous economic consequences with prices of oil, trade, instability. If you were to try to sum up the economic perspective on this in a situation room, telling a president what you should think about, what we should plan for, what would it be? And I'll start with you, Ken.
Sure. I think you're right, Major. This is a critical issue, and I think actually one of the mistakes that we made after 9/11 was to assume that somehow economics weren't involved in the unhappiness of the people of the Arab world. It's not the only thing going on, but it's where it all starts. The problem is, fixing the economic problems of the region is an enormous problem. It is going to take generations. And my advice to the President would be, Mr. President, you need to think about this both in a short-term and a long-term perspective. There is no short-term fix. There is only a long-term fix. But there are certainly things that you can do in the short term that will help alleviate the situation, that will reduce the demand for violent change in those countries where there has been transformation, that will make it easier to sustain a new government and a path toward democracy. And there, the biggest thing that we're going to need is twofold. First, we're going to need the Congress to get in the giving vein, something they are not ready to do right now. And the second thing is we need to go to our friends, especially in the region. These oil countries that have massive sovereign wealth funds, and we need to put together an Arab development fund that will help bolster these economies. Something along those lines, but not necessarily all American money. I mean, at this point in time, there's a lot of money sloshing around in the Gulf and elsewhere. That money needs to be harnessed to help buffer these economies. Over the longer term, though, it is about changing the structure of the economies. It is about changing, in particular, the structure of the workplace. And there, the real issue, which nobody's talked about because it's such a huge one, is education. And it's not the quantity of education, it is the quality of it. We now have 8 Arab Human Development Reports. These are magnificent documents written by Arab scholars and experts from the Arab world itself, and they have pointed to this enormous deficit in Arab educational methods, which is preventing the Arabs from joining a knowledge-based economy. That, over the long term, is what's got to change.
I agree with Ken. I take a different tack in the situation where I say, Mr. President, there are 22 countries undergoing the most important transformation, potentially, in the history of the modern history of the Arab world. This is a huge seismic event, and as Ken says, you have to plan short-term and long-term. In the short term, if you take a snapshot today, March 2nd, 2011, there are a couple of countries among those 22 that are very important, vital for the United States, beginning with Saudi Arabia. And if you're thinking of the economic consequences of what's happened over the last 6 weeks, Saudi Arabia is obviously in the central position. What does the Saudi strategic picture look like right now? They're very worried because the Shia revolt in Bahrain could possibly succeed. That's going to unnerve the Saudis because of their Shia population in the eastern province. Our former ambassador to Yemen said publicly yesterday he gives the Saleh government 50-50 chance of survival in Yemen, right on Saudi Arabia's border. Saudi Arabia is watching what happens in Iran. And again, that snapshot, unfortunately, because I'm an opponent of the Iranian regime, is that Iran's been an early winner. Because Hezbollah has strengthened itself in Lebanon, and Hamas has strengthened itself over Fatah in the Palestinian territories. And the Iranians, I think, will draw all the wrong conclusions from these events. So the Saudis are obviously very worried, reinforcing the American position with the Saudis, helping the Saudis to get through this intact, I think, is a very strong American interest here. I'd mention another country, Israel. I'm a strong supporter of the state of Israel. You have to see Israel as maybe a short-term loser here. Its strategic position has dramatically weakened, mainly because you can't foresee what's going to happen in Egypt. And should the military government not stay in power, should there be a transition to some type of new government, perhaps a coalition government in which the Muslim Brotherhood takes part, there is going to be, as sure as the day, an effort in Egypt to weaken its relationship with Israel. And so the Israelis are going to have to be very sophisticated, not saying too much publicly, but about repositioning themselves to defend against this weakened strategic position in which they find themselves. The stakes are very, very high here. And just picking up the paper this morning, I think the Saudi position is not under threat, but they're certainly worried about what's happening all around their border today.
Mm-hmm. Mike?
Let me, as a professional intelligence officer on the panel, I have the professional responsibility to be pessimistic. All right. But Nick mentioned something very interesting: short and long term. Let me give you a thought, and it has to do internally with the economics and other developments inside the Arab world, and we'll get to the global impact in a minute, I'm sure. When I look at the war on terror, going on for the last 10 years, American military thought generally divides a fight between the close fight and the deep fight. And we developed it actually trying to fight the Soviets in Europe. You know, the people were coming in over the perimeter wire, and the second, third, and fourth echelons downstream. And our strategy for that war was to affect the deep fight so that what was coming in over the perimeter wire tomorrow and the next day was digestible in terms of our defenses. Well, if you take that model and apply it to the war on terror, we've actually done a very good job with the close fight. We have taken off the battlefield, to use the popular euphemism, those people who are already committed to killing us. We have done precious little about dealing with the production rate of those people who tomorrow or the next day will want to come over the perimeter wire to kill us. And one of the problems we've had in doing that is that that's kind of a war of ideas. And when it was all about Islam, and in a discussion about the future of Islam, we aren't really very legitimate in participating in that discussion. I know we're multicultural, but we're fundamentally a Judeo-Christian Western European society. What's happened in the last 2 months has put another future, another discussion about what happens in this region on the table. And it's a thought process about which we do have some legitimacy, be it economic or democratic, pluralism or transparency. This is actually, I think, given, and I realize, all the close-in dangers, all the close-in instabilities that we have to deal with. This may be the first time in 10 years that we actually have an opportunity to affect the deep fight in what is considered to be one of the most serious threats to our security.
Raghida, run with that, because I know you want to.
Yeah, I want to. If I were sitting with President Obama, I would say the following. I say, let's take a look at the emergence of the new Arab. The new Arab who might be the one that belongs to a new party, if you will, the internet party, if you want to call it, you know, whatever you want to call it. But it is not the Arab of 9/11, and it's not the Arab of, the phenomena of the mosque, that you go to the mosque in order to object to the security apparatus that's ruling. So there is an emergence of the new Arab who didn't only go up to the square and revolted, but also went the next day and cleaned up the square. And these are very sophisticated new Arabs. They know. They don't need education, from up to down. They need to be helped from down to up. That is to say, we can talk about the new free trade agreements for these new countries under the new regimes. We can think economically. What does it take to cushion the emergence of the new alternative? And that is to say, again, the new Arab, the alternative between the radicals and the religious. And that would also require, I would say, Mr. President, that you really get firm with what would undermine the moderates and the new Arab, and that is the issue of Israel. I'd say you've been failed for 2 years in delivering on your promises on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Be firm. We know the contours of a solution. Put your foot down. Get that off the table. Because as long as that is on the table, the new Arab is going to be undercut by the radicals, whom we are not confronting in Iran and Syria and the likes. So we really need to, for the national interest of the United States of America, we need to talk about that and now. The last thing I would say, speak to China, because China plays or speaks the language of oil in the region. And the good thing about the Obama administration, unlike the Bush administration, it's saying to these partners, international partners, come, be part of the cake, if you will. Whereas in the past, the Bush administration said, this is ours, get out. This is our doctrine is different. And I think it is opportune time right now for the Obama administration, and I think they're doing that, to speak to China, in particular to Russia, in a way that let us see how can we put our lot together and really help the new Arab do something for
I
the
know
Arab
you want
world.
to jump in.
Yeah, just quickly, and I just wanted to say I think it's remarkable to watch China in this crisis.
Yeah.
All the talk of a rising China. China's going to eclipse the United States in global power. China has all these interests in the Middle East. Where has China been? Invisible in this crisis. Hiding behind the Russians and the Security Council. Hiding this news from their own people. Blocking the National Journal and Fox News from getting into China because they don't want the Chinese people to see what's happening in the rest of the world, not using China's considerable political influence to help. So I think you're exactly right. President Obama is looking, he's kind of like the corporate virtual chairman of the board, right, of the global governing board of the world. He's got this very important director called China down at the end of the table, kind of looking at the BlackBerry, looking at its oil prices, but not helping out.
Playing Angry Birds.
Not helping out. Yeah.
Sudan, Libya, etc.
Not helping out to adjudicate these crises, not using political influence, not playing a leadership role. I think it's an interesting insight into the limited mercantilistic role that China plays in the world today. So the president
But they did allow us in the Security Council to take the issue of Gaddafi to the International Court, to ICC, International Criminal Court. That was big, and that was a big resolution that they allowed us to get by.
And they won't let us do anything significant of a military dimension because China doesn't want that being turned on them.
Right. You can also turn this around. I mean, what's also interesting is that nobody in the region is demanding to know China's position on any of this stuff.
Right.
And while we can talk about our relative decline and we don't have as much influence, and all that's true, and it's part of that humility that Mike was talking about, which is so critically important, by the same token, we have to recognize that, we still play this outsized role and that we still have a lot of influence. And I, for one, was surprised at how much influence we actually were able to exert over the situation in Egypt, but it's clearly there.
I want to turn the conversation to Al-Qaeda. In Monday's New York Times, there was a news analyst story that under the headline, Al-Qaeda sees history fly by. Someone you might know, Mike, a gentleman named Paul Pillar, who was a Middle East expert at the CIA for 30 years, said the following: so far, and I emphasize so far, I'm directly quoting, the scorecard looks pretty terrible for Al-Qaeda. Democracy is bad news for terrorists. The more peaceful channels people have to express grievances and pursue their goals, the less likely they are to turn to violence. Do we agree?
It's true, but don't bank on it. It's true for the moment, but don't bank on it. That's what the only thing I would say.
Paul and I are kind of singing from the same page of the hymnal with my comment about, again, great danger, success not guaranteed. But here's an opportunity that did not exist 2, 5, 6, 8 years ago with regard to terrorism. And, I mean, Al-Qaeda has been shown to be irrelevant to what's happened here. I can't think of anything more damning to the movement and to the movement's self-image. No, you're right. We have it fully within our ability to mess this up, for Al-Qaeda to take advantage of the confusion and the disillusion and move forward. But there's opportunity.
And I guess let me slightly reframe the question, because is this sense that Al-Qaeda is seeing history fly by our sense of Al-Qaeda as we knew it in the Badlands of Pakistan, but not necessarily operationally in Yemen or in other places where it is trying to move? Is there a different... I kept Mike, in the years after 9/11, hearing this franchising metaphor about Al-Qaeda, that you have a central nervous system, but the more important thing to watch is the franchising effect. And we've seen lately in the headlines and Justice Department actions in our own country, homegrown or home-motivated radicalized terrorists. So is it Al-Qaeda's watching history fly by from the Al-Qaeda we knew and educated ourselves back 9/11, but maybe it's not watching history fly by in Yemen or other places?
No, I would dissociate it. What Paul's talking about, what I was trying to suggest, was at the very strategic level. This talks about the vision of Al-Qaeda being challenged, and they're being shown to be less relevant than they pretended to be to the future of the Islamic world. Certainly if this moves in a certain direction. Below that, at the operational and tactical level, there is still great momentum. There's still going to be great danger. Even if these tectonic plates shift, we're still going to have to do all the things we've been doing to defend ourselves against those folks who are already convinced. But over the long term, my last week in government, Rahm Emanuel poked me in the back after a sit-room meeting. We had an operational success. And he said, hey, good on you guys. We had taken a terrorist off the battlefield. And I said, thanks, Rahm. And my last chance to make a comment to the incoming administration was, but that was a counterterrorism success. Unless you want to do this forever, you have to change the facts on the ground. And now we have more of an opportunity to do that.
Nick, do you want to weigh in on the al-Qaeda question?
I was just going to say, I think the opportunity here is for the Arab people themselves.
That's right.
Those young people, I mean, weren't they inspirational in Tahrir Square? And the young people in Bahrain, they've been inspirational because they've been peaceful, they're arguing for the right things, and they're the counterpoint to al-Qaeda. So I really think it's an Arab drama more than anything else, but I think I would also say we have to, this has been a roller coaster. And we've been surprised at every turn. And should the government fall in Yemen, in that tribal-based society, there's every possibility that a much more radical regime could come in to the detriment of our interests and the people of Yemen. So far so good, but only so far.
And the Saudis have succeeded. Let's remember, I think Ken would also, you would agree with this, the Saudis had very much succeeded in curbing the al-Qaeda inside Saudi Arabia. So if we have Yemen right now disintegrate or fall apart or become, there's a void there, I would worry very much. And right now, if in the Saudi, for example, you mentioned the king and how they, there's something very new. You have intellectuals, leaders of businesses, have written recently, this week, they've written to the king, they've written to the leadership. They said, we need reform, and here's how we need it. They said it in 4-page letter. So if they are aware that al-Qaeda's danger coming from Yemen into their own country, so the Arab individual, the new Arab, the responsible Arab, is very active in defeating al-Qaeda, unless we mess up badly in Yemen and the likes.
If I could just add a point to this, which is, we're making a point implicitly. I think it's important to make explicitly, which is you've got to see terrorism and what's going on in the region as being all part of the same thing. We have focused exclusively on terrorism since 9/11 up until this point in time. It was a mistake. It was an overemphasis on terrorism. Terrorism is a symptom of a larger set of problems. The revolts that are breaking out all across the Middle East are also a symptom of that larger set of political, economic, and social problems. It is about getting at the economic stuff that you're talking about, but we've got to see this all together. That's Mike's point about the deep battlefield is, we can kill a whole bunch of terrorists, but if you are not going to deal with the underlying grievances that are both giving rise to the terrorists and to the revolutions, we're not actually going to change anything in the Middle East, including our own endless problems there.
A common thread in this discussion, of course, has been the future of despotism, and any moderator will know, if he's honest with himself or herself, that there's a gentle despotism that a moderator exercises because they control the whole floor. They control all the questions, up until now. I invite any one of you, if you are so motivated, to please avail yourself of the mics we have in the audience. If you have a question for this outstanding panel, if it wasn't clear to you before just how great it was, it is obviously clear to you now. So I invite you, if you are so motivated, raise your hand. We'll get a microphone to you. Please ask questions, because if you don't ask them, I've got plenty more.
With Citibank, one area of the world that was not mentioned at all during the conversation was Europe. They tend to refer to the region you've discussed as part of their neighborhood. What do you, as the panelists, see Europe's role in all of this?
Nick?
Well, I think that when the international spotlight was on Egypt, there was a country where the United States had overriding influence. The Europeans didn't exert the type of influence that we had. But now you're seeing, especially with Libya, that Italy and France have a much better understanding of that country than we do. They have much deeper rooted historical ties. And I think the Obama administration made a very concerted effort last week publicly to try to work through President Sarkozy and Prime Minister Berlusconi. And as we talk about NATO, which is a great collective defense organization, those are the two key countries. If there is going to be a no-flight zone in the future, I don't think there will be. But if there would be, we would want to do it through NATO, because we'd want some of the burden, the very heavy military and economic burden, to be carried by some of the allies. So I think appropriately, just as the Bush administration did, the Obama administration is going to try to look through its European allies to play a bigger role in North Africa. But I would just say, finally go back to one of Ken's points, the United States has not lost a lot of influence in the Middle East. Now, we may end up strategically suffering a year or two from now, given the unpredictability of these events, but what this whole roiling series of crises tell me is that we still have considerable influence in the Gulf and in the Levant, which is where the power base, the oil, and the militaries are. We have to exercise that with great caution and great skill. So far, so good, but it might even be harder in the next couple of months because we may see a standoff of a considerable duration in Libya that's going to occupy our attention for a long time to come.
I've got a bit of an attitude issue with the Europeans. From my point of view, don't jump out in front very often in terms of these crises. They're reasonably comfortable letting the Americans take the lead. But in this case, I actually think we're going to see good, sustained, and positive European activity here for a couple of reasons. Number one, they, not we, have massive expatriate communities from most of these countries, and they, not we, will have to bear the burden of refugees fleeing out of destabilized states along North Africa. So I think the Europeans are going to be very active partners in a very positive way in this.
So old Europe to the rescue. Any other questions? Yes, sir, up at the top.
I think we'd all be interested in hearing how the panel handicaps the situation in Libya, short-term, long-term.
Well, I think you said it. You already said. I think we're in for. It's not happening quickly. I think we may be dragged in. The leadership in Libya doesn't give any signs that it gets it, or that it's willing to. The world is not willing to deal with them, and they decided, well, they'll deal with it, Libya, their own way. They will play the tribal card. They will go to the last man there. They don't care if their assets are frozen. They must have stashed enough somewhere else. And I think they, right now, Gaddafi, I don't expect Gaddafi to go down easily.
Let me inject a thought into this. Does it make it easier operationally or more difficult operationally if we wanted to be of assistance, maybe not in an overt way, that the borders in Tunisia and Egypt are now much, if not more porous, they're up for grabs?
Yeah.
Does that make things harder or easier? Does it make a difference? Mike?
I don't know. I mean, and that's always a good answer from an intelligence officer. You can never go wrong. Yeah. You're always right with that. Fulfilling my constitutional responsibility for pessimism, I agree that we appear to be moving in a situation of stasis in which one cannot not defeat the other. Yeah. And that's probably the worst of all possible outcomes. There's a subplot to that really gets pessimistic. And here, what you've got is the part of the country beyond the reach of the Gaddafi government is eastern Libya. Right. For better or for worse, that's the homeland of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. That's where al-Qaeda influence, to the degree that it exists, has been nurtured. And so to the degree that becomes an ungoverned area in this drama, if we get stasis at the top in terms of the civil war, you really get a lot of close-in practical problems, which then leads you to perhaps be a bit more forward-leaning about what you might want to do with North African partners along the border to try to shape events there.
I'll just add, first, kind of a general point, which is that we need to recognize that this common wellspring of unhappiness all across the Arab world is producing similar revolts. But the revolts play out in very idiosyncratic ways dependent on the particular dynamics of the country. And in Libya, what did start out as a revolt very similar to Tunisia, to Egypt, is now devolving into a more traditional geographic tribal civil war. That's not a very hopeful scenario. And of course, the Libyan state, not as strong as the Egyptian state, didn't have the same degree of institutions. I began life as an intelligence analyst. I graduated from that, but I still share Mike's pessimism coming from those days. It's hard to see how Libya turns out well. And that gets to the roots of your question, Mary Jo, which is, yes, it's a little bit easier to get stuff into Libya, but it begs the question of what do you want to get in and who do you want to get it to?
Right, and at what risk?
Exactly.
So there is a humanitarian disaster, but also there is
we have teeming throngs of refugees trying to get out of Libya now, hundreds of thousands. The camps along the borders, utterly inadequate. It's a scenario we've seen play out many, many times before. We have a burgeoning humanitarian crisis.
But if, in fact, we do have a civil war, and in fact we do have a partition, if you will, of Libya, and then, I don't know what's happening to the oil land in Libya. This is another thing we need to get into. But that is going to make it, to your question, a rather risky place, and then success is not the necessary conclusion to the story.
You know, it's a really good question. In Egypt, for all of his faults, Hosni Mubarak chose to leave honorably and peacefully and didn't try to blow up his country when he was leaving power. Gaddafi is not an honorable person. His back's to the wall. He is vicious and brutal. His 7 sons who run the security apparatus, command an army of several thousand mercenaries who will fight to the last man if they're asked. And so I fear what Mike is saying is that we've reached a point where maybe we're going to see a protracted civil war. Does it make sense for the United States, in a country in which we do not have vital interests and do not have a history and do not have influence, to leap in? I think we should be very cautious and turn our attention to where our vital interests are: Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran, Egypt, that part of the Arab world. We do have to make some strategic choices here, and I think the administration has made them.
I just add one additional point. We need to be very careful. It will be an easy default option to show activity, to go down the path of something broadly labeled humanitarian aid. And I understand that, and it's noble, and we ought to do that. We ought to do it with great care. I witnessed this in Bosnia for 3 years, where humanitarian aid ended up being the quartermaster for all the warring factions and shielded them from the natural consequences of continuing the fight. If not done carefully, it actually extends the conflict.
It sustains.
Yeah.
Those who are taking up arms.
If we don't plan to help the Libyan people right now, let's stop giving them hope that the world
and
is
raising,
coming
as
to
you
the
said
rescue.
before, expectations.
It would be really almost immoral for the international community to give them an indication that, yes, we're coming to your rescue, yes, we're going to do something about it, and then when it goes into the difficult moment, the civil war, whatever it is, we leave them. I think we should either deliver or don't raise expectations.
With all due respect, I don't think that's fair. I think the Obama administration is backing away from Libya, and Secretary Gates came out very clearly yesterday and said, this is not a good idea. And he listed all the reasons why it's not a good idea. So I think it's, we have given every indication we'll be fundamentally involved in Egypt, but I don't think it's fair to say we haven't.
But the day before,
well, we have said things about the aspirations of those who are trying to overthrow Gaddafi, and that his regime is intolerable and it must go. Well, if it must go, by what means? And that has to be heard by those who are trying to uproot the Gaddafi regime in some context other than strict U.S. neutrality.
And we even said everything is on the table, too. We said everything.
Every option is on the table.
Many of the officials, Clinton and others, every option is on the table.
And as all of you know, what we say and the interpretation of what we say can sometimes occupy a tremendous amount of space.
And this gets back to this gets back to humility, which Mike talked about, and restraint, and choosing your fights, and not thinking that the United States can direct affairs across the vast expanse of the Arab world. We simply can't do that.
Okay, you guys are doing great. Any more questions? Because this is up there at the top. Yeah. Oh, right here. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Then we'll get to you up in the corner.
Hi, my question is about the relationship between diplomatic and military influence and power. And given the economic pressure in this country and Europe, how much capacity do we have militarily to put the might behind our diplomatic influence?
Mike?
We're in the business of conserving conflicts right now. We've got plenty. And sorry, I don't mean to be so flippant, but you can see it in the language of the chairman and the Secretary of Defense, emphasizing.
But I mean, you're being glib, but that's an operational reality.
No, it's very real. I mean, look, it's taken a week to get the Kearsarge and one other ship out of the Red Sea into the Med. That used to be an American lake with the Sixth Fleet. Right. But we're redeployed. Our center of gravity is further to the east. Now, as Ken points out, we're not trivial here. We are a very powerful, very efficient military force, and when we bring power to bear, it is almost exquisite in the way we do it. But that said, we are badly stretched, and we need to be very careful not to overpromise.
And I think that's really the issue. Is it's not the military power. The military power will be there if the nation believes it's necessary. The issue is the political ones, both domestic politics and diplomacy. What is it that we're trying to do in Libya? What would the purpose of using military force be? Is it going to advance our interests, or is it going to undermine those interests? And the interests have to be written broadly, not just with Libya, but in other places. And as Mike is also pointing out, and this also gets to a point that Nick was making, how many places are we going to be able to intervene? If there is a problem in the Gulf, are we going to regret having tied down huge assets in North Africa, given how important the Gulf is?
And from your expertise, Nick, NATO expertise, willingness, desire.
I think you're going to have to compartmentalize these crises. The Europeans will need to focus, for a lot of reasons, and you cited them, on North Africa. We need to focus on the parts of the world that are important to us. Very smart man, Secretary Colin Powell, former military officer, used to say, here's how you position your national assets. The diplomats are out front. The military is the last reserve. And I think you'll see more of Secretary Clinton in the next couple of weeks and months than you will Secretary Gates as the leading actor for the United States, because these problems don't lend themselves, most of them, to the use of military force. It's the slow, patient, frustrating work of working with governments, urging reform, trying to deal with refugee flows, the short and long-term dichotomy that Ken has talked about. No easy answers. We have to stay focused on it, because I'd argue we're global, right? We're important in every part of the world, but this area of the greater Middle East is the most vital region to our national security interests. So we got to stay involved, hopefully in a sophisticated and smart way.
If it's not obvious by now, we could talk about this for the next 4 hours quite easily and still have many more issues to discuss, many more questions to ask. But time is finite, and we have one final question, and I identified the gentleman up there in the far right-hand corner, so please ask your question, and then I'll hand this back to Mark French in just a couple of minutes.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fantastic discussion. I'm thinking that I should be an intelligence officer, because I'm sharing the pessimism of General Hayden and Mr. Pollack. It seems to me that in a certain sense the United States is caught in the middle of two priorities. The ambassador made the case, and I think compellingly so, that we have a real interest in helping to preserve good friends in the region, the Saudis, perhaps the regime in Yemen, perhaps the regime in Bahrain. On the other hand, I think the narrative and the explanation that there has to be a vehicle and a path for reform, so that the bad guys in the region don't draw the wrong conclusion. And I find the narrative very compelling that, the achievements of the protesters in Egypt and elsewhere are really bad for al-Qaeda. I mean, the protesters in Tahrir Square accomplished more in 17 days or whatever it took than al-Qaeda's accomplished in 20 years. I think that's a compelling narrative in the region and very good for the United States. The problem is that people don't want limited reform. When people get a taste of freedom, they want it all. And we saw this in Tahrir Square. Mubarak kept saying over and over and over again, okay, I'm going to do this. Okay, I'm going to appoint this guy. I'm going to get rid of these people. I'm going to agree to this. And the answer over and over and over again was, no, it's not enough. We want you gone. We want our freedom. And so it seems to me that the strategy of trying to facilitate and provide a channel using our influence to achieve limited reform, enough reform to sort of keep a lid on things for our friends, runs headlong into the strategy of trying to protect the friends in the region. It seems to me it's got to be one or the other, and in the middle, you're stuck.
It's a good way to wrap this up. Do we have a clash of narratives here? Do we have something that is unstoppable and not really directable? And I want to put that to everyone. We'll start, and we'll come all the way toward me.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think that what it really gets to is, again, our failure to have pushed reform much more forcefully, much more firmly, and much more intelligently in the past. And we've now got ourselves into a situation where we are smack dab in the middle of a whole bunch of revolutions, and you're right. In the middle of a revolution, limited reform is never enough. A couple of points. First, where the countries have actually revolted, you're absolutely right. Limited reform ain't going to be enough. And that's why the transition that we are pushing, the full-fledged transition to democracy that we are pushing in Egypt, is exactly the right course of action. That said, there are other countries out there where there has not been that revolt. We've pointed to Morocco, we've pointed to Saudi Arabia. They haven't revolted, as best we can tell, because their kings did adopt programs of reform. But you're also right to focus on the word limited, which is, at some level, they can't be limited in scope. They can be limited perhaps in time. That is, they can move at a gradual pace. I would actually argue that most Saudis like the fact that their reforms are moving fairly slowly. Yes, Raghida's right, there's a group of intellectuals, of liberals who are pushing for faster, but Saudi Arabia is a fairly conservative society, and there is a fear of opening Pandora's box. So as long as there is a sense that things are moving forward and going to continue to move forward, people can adapt and can be accustomed, even in some cases, like a more gradual pace, certainly than the rapid pace that you saw in Egypt. But what they have to believe is that the change is real and it's going to be sustained. The problem with Mubarak is he kept promising reform and then taking it away. That was the real problem.
Mike?
Yeah, this clash of narratives, I think, is absolutely accurate, but it happens all the time. I mean, that's why we do what we used to do when we were in government, because you have these conflicting things and you're trying to find how do I accommodate both sets of realities. My anecdote with regard to this, following up what Ken said, late in my time as director, Omar Suleiman asked me to stay over an extra day in Cairo to meet with Mubarak. So we went out on a Saturday morning to the presidential palace, and for 90 minutes, the president of Egypt berated me on the short-sighted American policy trying to force him to democratize. You don't understand my situation. You don't understand these people, the threat from the Muslim Brotherhood. And then he'd lean forward and say, now, General, I'm not talking about you personally, and then to go back to his rant. We probably owed President Mubarak, who was a good friend, a much larger dose of tough love during this period of time to get him to do some of the things he ultimately agreed to do, but by that point it was far too late. And so it probably needs a sustained effort. And I must admit, and I think Nick would agree, the last year or two of the Bush administration, we were diverted to other things rather than focusing on the president's freedom agenda. I don't think President Obama has signed up to it in the same way after the Cairo speech as Ken has suggested. Now's the time for those private conversations with good friends, and the best way I can describe it is a tough love message.
Raghida?
Yeah, I think it's a very exhilarating moment as far as what's happening in the Arab region. And it's a very dangerous one if we don't have our feet in the ground. We need to be helping the emergence of the new person, the new Arab, but also I think it's important not to absolve others from as much, not tough love, but tough act, as we have applied in Egypt. And I have in mind Iran. If Iran comes out with this, with the strengthening of the regime, I think that would be a terrible, terrible result of altogether, meaning that is to say the moderates, the friends of the United States, would have been weakened as states, and Iran, the defiant, would, together with Syria, would have been strengthened. And then they could dictate to the region. So I think it's very important that the Obama administration takes a very good look at its own policies towards the region altogether. It is the time to review whether it is the right policy that we have towards Iran. As you said, that the aircraft carrier of the United States took so long to come, or two Iranian aircraft carriers just crossed the Suez Canal, and that was like that. So we need to pay attention to what we're doing with Iran, review the policy there, keep an eye on what's going on in Syria, Lebanon, because that's very important, and direct with Israel. And as I said, really deliver on the Israeli issue, Palestinian-Israeli issue, because that is how you strengthen the moment and the new Arab to really make a difference and hopefully go towards constructive engagement with the world rather than back to being all over the place, pulled by Al-Qaeda once and the Islamists or the military on the other hand.
Nick, a rare privilege. As a diplomat, you get the last word.
We've been dealing with this strategic dilemma of competing interests for my entire career in government. And I think you're right to pose the question. I just say two quick things. First, I told my students at Harvard the other day, I said, picture President Obama up on a high wire, no net. He's juggling these competing priorities. We have to stand up for democracy and freedom in places where the people want that and where there's a movement towards that. Egypt is the opportunity there. We also have to do something else. Safeguard our interests. Israel, defeat Al-Qaeda, contain Iran, free flow of oil. We've got to do all of it together in one coherent policy. That's not impossible. And I guess I go out on a limb here, Major, and just make a prediction I'd say the Gulf states, with the exception of Bahrain, are going to ride out this crisis. They are relatively stable. I would expect them to come through it. You're going to see a lot of instability in North Africa, in Libya and Algeria. The country to watch is Egypt. It's the keystone country. It's the heart and soul of the Arab world. It's the largest country. It's the most powerful military. If there can be a slow evolution towards a better Egypt, a more democratic Egypt, we should be there to support it, and we should help in every way we can. But we have to protect those other interests as well. That's called statecraft and diplomacy. That's the challenge for our president.
You know, Leading Authorities calls this Conversations with Power. I work with words, so I'm constantly rearranging and editing words. I would call this Conversations with the Brilliant. And I speak on behalf of everyone here on this panel, thanking Leading Authorities for this opportunity. You've been a fantastic audience, and I'm sure the virtual audience has been just as good. Sorry I couldn't take questions from you. Maybe we'll do that in the future. Mark, with all of our gratitude, I turn it back over to you, and I hope we've educated you and everyone in the audience.
Major, thank you very much. You know, I lived in Los Angeles for 7 years, and I learned that there's a common truth in Hollywood that the best acts are those that leave their audiences wanting more. And by every measure, you have left us wanting more. So thank you so much. We are very proud to represent this entire panel exclusively. And I think that today there is probably no greater issue to our country than events in the Middle East. So I encourage you to consider this panel for your future events. I'd like to again thank the panel. I'd like to thank again our sponsors, CEO Update, Citibank, the Broadmoor, and Smart Brief. And I'd like to pay tribute to our production team at Leading Authorities that actually produced this event. Our next Conversations with Power program will be in May. Stay tuned. We'll be in touch. And thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you to today's sponsors who helped to make this broadcast possible. CEO Update, Citibank, The Broadmoor, and Smart Brief. If you would like more information on one of today's Conversations with Power participants or another Leading Authority speaker, please contact us at 1-800-SPEAKER.